I was a security officer at the Somerset Mall. I'd been there for 6 months at that point, and that's when I started noticing something strange. My shift had changed and I'd begun working the later window. It was mundane work, walking the corridors, checking the store gates, making sure nobody was tucked away in fitting rooms or bathrooms. Then I'd spend most of the night watching the CCTV set. It was pretty cushy for the most part, busting teens trying to stay after closing, or escorting a homeless man off the property. It was routine. I was the guy who whistled while he worked, keys jingling on my belt. I enjoyed the uniform, the small authority I was given. I followed the same patrol every night. I'd cross the food court, head down one corridor and toward the next. There were a few other security officers, but we covered different sections and communicated via walkie-talkies in the rare event something went wrong. When you follow the same patrol long enough, you start noticing things. You start counting the checkered tiles of varying colors. The storefronts and display windows became my milestones. I guess that's when I first noticed. Penny had moved. Penny was just a nickname I ended up giving the mannequin later. One of several mannequins in the JCPenney window. She didn't have any defining features outside what she wore. It was just a mannequin after all. But one night, after passing that window God knows how many times, I looked in and saw she'd shifted. It was subtle at first, barely enough to register. But I looked into that window every night, and on this night, she was set back from the others, slightly off-center, head angled a touch to the side. It was enough to make me stop, though not enough to cause alarm. The merchandisers must have been in a hurry and neglected to position her properly. But I think that's when I started paying attention. And that's also when things started getting, well, weird. The next night, Penny had shifted further back. The night after that, further still. Then one night, Penny wasn't there at all. She must have been pulled from the floor set, but there was a strange gap where she once stood. You'd think they'd add another mannequin to fill that space, or slide the others inward to create a more uniform display. Corporations take their storefronts seriously. It had been nearly a week. I'd make my rounds, and there would be no Penny. Then she was back, but not where she belonged. I remember turning the corner toward the JCPenney storefront and feeling my stomach rise into my throat. Penny was standing in the hallway. She was facing me, as if anticipating me. My heart hammered. I was actually shaking. It was so unreal. A dark, empty mall, and this mannequin, wearing a sleeveless satin dress with silver strappy heels, standing there in the corridor, looking at me. That was the part I couldn't explain. I suppose these were the dangers of giving human traits to something devoid of life. I'd given her a name, and in doing so, I'd given her the power to scare me. The fear only lasted a minute. She didn't move, didn't blink. It was a mannequin. I unlocked the gate and disabled the alarm. I threw Penny over my shoulder like we were honeymooners and carried her back inside, placing her as neatly as possible in the display window. I locked up and stepped back. There she was again, back where she belonged. All was right once more, until it wasn't. Before the next shift, I approached Richie and Seth. We were the sort of kind of friends who grabbed drinks on off days and played poker here and there. When I mentioned the mannequin, they looked at me in a mild amusement, unsure where I was going with all this. I described what had happened the night before, and based on their reactions alone, I was fairly certain they had nothing to do with it. They figured it was some kid playing a prank, maybe even an employee, bored out of their mind. If it happened again, I should report it. We had camera feeds covering that corridor. We could always scrub the playback. That night, after finishing my rounds, I planned to do exactly that. I passed the JCPenney storefront and found Penny had escaped again. I continued through the mall, half expecting to find her around every corner, ready to startle me. But I made it all the way back to the security room without seeing her. Where did Penny go when nobody was watching? I had to stop thinking like that. Stop thinking of this mannequin as if it were a real person. It was beginning to disturb me. Back at the console, I pulled up the previous night's footage and scrubbed through. There I was, placing Penny back in the display window. I rewound further. There she was, standing in the hallway. I kept going back to when the stores were still open, and there were shoppers moving through the corridor. I slowed it down. The last wave of customers drifted past the storefront. Then Penny was there. I slowed it further, frame by frame, leaning in close to the monitor to make out the grainy details. Through the low-resolution haze, I saw something. A woman exiting JCPenney. She wore a satin dress, silver heels. She paused, the image blurred in the movement of the crowd. But Penny stood there. I replayed it again and again. The quality was poor. A woman walked out of the store, stopped, and remained, until I carried her back inside. I monitored that storefront for weeks afterward, but Penny never returned. Eventually, they filled that space with another mannequin. How I knew it wasn't her is hard to explain. I just knew. I worked there another 18 months before finding a new job. Occasionally, I'd catch myself thinking about it. What had happened, and how. It was something you couldn't share without sounding unhinged. Even if somehow I'd stolen the tape, the footage wasn't clear enough for anyone else to see what I'd seen. It was one of those things. You had to be there. 2 weeks ago, I went back to the mall. It closed in 2015, nearly 2 decades since I'd worked there. Strange to think I once spent so much time keeping people out, and now I was trespassing. It wasn't difficult to get in. One of the rear service doors hung loose from its hinges. I stepped inside and followed my old patrol one last time, just for memory's sake. Past the food court where the once colorful tile floor was cracked and dulled by years of grime. Dust floated through beams of dim light. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped steadily. I stepped over broken glass and debris as I passed storefronts, some still bearing fragments of their old lettering. Graffiti covered the walls until it didn't, as if even vandals eventually grew tired of defacing a place no one would see. I reached the JCPenney. The branding was gone, but I knew. The corridor stood silent. Inside the display window was a single mannequin, stripped of clothing, filthy and bald and streaked with years of decay. She stood there, head angled slightly toward the corridor, toward me, as if anticipating my arrival all these years. And I knew. It was Penny, as if she were saying something without saying it at all. Look at us. We're still here. We never left. In 2015, the mall flooded so badly that water reached the second step of the escalator. What they didn't tell anyone was what they found when it receded. It was 6 straight weeks of rain nobody had architecturally planned for. The mall sat at the base of a set of hills, and that was enough to do it. At first, the stores stayed open. Shoppers moved about as usual. Some slipped in the puddles forming in the corners of the corridors, but management simply treated it like an inconvenience. It wasn't until a week in that they finally shut everything down. I worked for a remediation company, contracted alongside a handful of others to deal with the damage, or whatever passed for dealing with something that catastrophic. People don't realize how difficult it is to account for mold. It's not just what you can see blooming along the drywall or creeping across tile. It spreads where you don't look. Behind walls, above ceiling panels, inside insulation. Water doesn't just sit, it seeps. And once it does, it doesn't leave quietly. For weeks, the mall was closed, and the owners were breathing down our necks to work faster. They were clearly losing money, but industrial fans only dry things so fast. We were assigned to a stretch of retail stores. Clothing still hung on racks, soaked and rotting. We all knew it would have to be thrown out. What they planned to do with that much ruined inventory was beyond my pay grade. We started demoing sections of linoleum that had gone soft to the touch. The tile gave way too easily under the pry bars. That's when I noticed something. Beneath the top layer of tile was more tile. As we chipped further, a new pattern began to emerge. Seafoam green and beige, small glossy squares in a dated geometric pattern, unmistakably from another decade. It was rotten through in the same way as the layer above, grout darkened, adhesive swollen from weeks underwater. We kept going. Beneath that second layer was a third, deep burgundy with muted gold trim, larger squares with a high gloss finish, the kind of floor that once tried to look expensive. It felt less like demolition and more like excavation, like I was looking at layers of sediment. We were peeling away generations of the mall, the 90s, the 80s, one layer at a time. It was as if they hadn't removed anything when they renovated. They just kept building on top. It was strange, staring down at the lost time in a hazmat suit. But it was even stranger when we started working away at the walls. It was late, and the storm had rolled back in. We were trying to stay ahead of it. The construction crews were outside, carving drainage trenches. But the water kept finding its way back in. It always does. The dressing rooms were carpeted, and all that had to go. The drywall was soaked through, soft and sagging, especially behind the mirrors. Black mold had already started freckling the edges. The mirrors might have been salvageable, but they had to come down so we could demo the walls. I took one down and leaned it carefully against a rack. Then I swung my sledgehammer into the drywall. I heard the sound of a crack. It was sharp, like glass shattering. I froze and glanced at the mirror behind me. It was fine. I turned back to the wall and started pulling away the broken sheetrock. That's when I sliced my palm, a thin, clean cut. I looked closer and saw it. Another mirror, behind the drywall. I pushed away a larger section and it came free in a heavy chunk, bringing a jagged shard of mirror with it. I picked it up. Through the dust and age, I saw my reflection in it, distorted and speckled. My face was half hidden in debris. But when I focused on it, there was a woman. Not standing behind me, not in the room, but in the glass. It wasn't a full reflection, just part of her face, like an image burned into an old television screen. She looked tired and disinterested, numb, dressed in a woman's suit, something corporate from the late 80s, maybe early 90s. It didn't make sense. Could a mirror burn an image if something reflected off of it long enough? Then I heard something. It was barely there, like someone taking in a quick breath, a small gasp. It startled me enough that I dropped the shard. It hit the floor and broke into smaller pieces, and when I looked down at them, it was only me, fragmented and broken. I stood there for a while before swinging the hammer again. When I did, I heard a low groaning sound from inside the wall. I paused and looked closer. Thin rivulets of water were running down the surface, like I cracked open a pipe, but there was no plumbing back here. At least not according to the CAD files we'd been given. I stepped closer, reaching out to peel back more drywall and clear the debris so I could see what was going on. Before I could get a better look, my supervisor called from the corridor and said there was an emergency meeting. I stepped out of the dressing room where I'd been working for the last few hours and felt my boots splash. Where we'd spent so much time drying the floors, remediating the damage, a new layer of water had risen. I looked up. Rain was hammering the skylight above, casting dull blue light across the mall interior. The power had been cut days ago to avoid electrical issues, so battery floodlights were set up along the corridor. Their beams cut through the damp air and made everything look hazy, like we were standing in smoke. My employer and a dozen other workers were gathered beneath the lights in their hazmat suits. For a second, the whole scene looked apocalyptic, like we were the last people left in the building. The project lead said they were having trouble identifying where the water was coming from. In situations like this, there's usually a breach somewhere, a collapsed section of the roof, a cracked foundation line, something obvious. Water travels unpredictably, sure, but you can usually trace it back to a source. Here, they couldn't. It wasn't pooling from one direction. It wasn't spilling in from a single wall. It was seemingly seeping in from everywhere, as if it were rising up through the floor, dripping from the ceiling, pressing through the walls. The storm outside was strong, but the flooding was isolated to the mall. It wasn't sewage, it wasn't gray water. It was clear, almost clean looking, like straight rain. We were being pulled off the project. At that point, it was less remediation and more structural failure. There's no sense in tearing out mold when the water is still coming in. It'd be like trying to bail out a dinghy that's taking on water from every seam. They never found a resolution. They simply shut it down, abandoned the mall entirely, left it flooding and sitting in its own filth. Last I heard, the clothing was still hanging on racks. The signage was still up. Nothing was salvageable. So they left it all in place to rot. I still think about what we might have found if we kept going. What was beneath that tile? Or behind the second mirror? Artifacts from a time that's long since passed. Or maybe not. I was a teenager in the late 90s, which meant, like many others, I worked at the mall. It was a dream job. I sat with my feet up most days, tucked inside a small office near the least used entrance, reading magazines and half-finishing Sudoku puzzles while the world drifted by outside. I loved the mall. Not for shopping. I wasn't even a window shopper. It was just the atmosphere. It was the place to be. The air always smelled faintly of pretzels and chlorine from the fountain. Music echoed from storefronts. People were always in a good mood, except when they walked into my office. You see, I ran the lost and found. You'd be surprised what people leave behind. Jackets on benches, portable phones on kiosks, credit cards tucked into arcade machines. The job wasn't hard. The hardest part was the accusations. People get tense when something personal disappears. I'd been accused more than once of pocketing valuables that came through my desk. That's the one thing I can say with certainty. I never stole anything. I never wanted to. I've never been materialistic. Most of what passed through my hands meant more to someone else than it ever could to me. Still, I handled every item personally. Logged it, tagged it, sometimes opened a wallet just long enough to find a name or number. One afternoon, I opened a wallet that was completely empty, except for a driver's license. The name inside was John Shoemaker. The address was local, nothing unusual there. What caught my attention was the age of it. The license was a thin, slightly warped card, about the size of a playing card, sealed in yellowing laminate that had begun to peel at the corners. The kind of ID you don't see anymore. Strangest of all was the photo. John Shoemaker looked like he was in his 30s, maybe early 40s at most. Thick, dark hair combed to the side with long sideburns, no gray at the temples. but the birthday read June 14th, 1946. That would have made him 52 when the wallet was found. The ID was 14 years expired. Most people don't bother carrying a license that outdated. I checked the wallet again. No credit cards or receipts. There were no folded bills or family photo tucked behind the sleeve. It was only a license. Just that frozen image of a man in his mid-30s. I ended up logging it as any other item and slid it into the filing cabinet behind me. At the time, I told myself it was just another oddity. The mall was full of things people left behind. It wasn't until later that I realized this was the beginning of something unexplainable. Days turned into months. The holiday rush crept in. My office filled to the point of bursting. Winter coats and half-wrapped gifts, cheap jewelry and abandoned shopping bags. This was the beginning of my busy season. I spent most shifts sorting, tagging, and hanging. One afternoon, while hanging a dust jacket in the closet, something slipped from the pocket and fluttered to the floor. It was a crumpled piece of neon paper. It was coffee-stained and folded 4 times over. The edges were gritty, almost sandy, like it had been handled too many times. I don't know why I opened it. I just did. Across the top, in thin black letters, it read, "Have you seen this person?" The photo beneath was faded, but the face felt familiar, not in a clear, immediate way, more like the feeling you get when you pass someone often without realizing it, the kind of face that blends into the background until it doesn't. The longer I looked at it, the more certain I became that I'd seen him, walking through the mall, sitting alone in the food court, riding down the escalator while I stood at the bottom. I couldn't place when or how many times, but the recognition felt all too real. It wasn't until a few days later, when I pulled open the cabinet behind my desk, that it all clicked. The man on the poster was John Shoemaker, and he hadn't aged a day. I had the license and the handbill side by side on my desk, both faded and worn. The resemblance was undeniable. What unsettled me wasn't just the photo. It was the lack of information. The handbill didn't list a phone number or a police department to contact. There was no date last seen, no height, no weight, no clothing description. Just the words, "Have you seen this person?" That was it. Seen him where? When? Who was even asking? It felt less like a call for help and more like a question directed at me. After that, even when I wasn't on the clock, I found myself scanning the mall, not actively searching, but always aware, watching faces in passing, glancing twice at anyone with dark hair and sideburns. John Shoemaker must have been over 50 years old. The man I remembered seeing wasn't. He had a steady stride and a relaxed posture. No gray. He looked like a bachelor in his 30s at most. The kind of guy who lingered in bookstores and ate alone in the food court without looking lonely. And the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that I hadn't just imagined him. I had seen him. More than once. It was January 3rd. I remember that clearly. I was working late, well past closing, finishing paperwork for the new year. The mall had that strange quiet it gets after hours. Most of the lights were off, leaving only the glow of neon storefront signs and blinking machines reflecting faintly across my office window. I had my head down when I heard the creak of the door. At first, I assumed it was the security guard making his rounds, or one of the janitors pushing a cart down the corridor. Then I looked up. The man was standing directly in front of my desk. I felt sick the moment I saw him. He wore a tan jacket beneath a camel trench coat, pressed slacks and brown shoes, the kind of outfit you'd expect from an office worker in another decade. His posture was straight, his hands relaxed at his sides. It was John Shoemaker. His face was pale, almost gray under the dim light, but unmistakably youthful. The same face from the license. It was the same man I had seen walking the mall. He said only one thing. I believe you have something of mine." I couldn't speak. My throat had closed completely. A wave of nausea rolled through me, cold and sudden. Without thinking, I turned toward the filing cabinet behind my desk and pulled open the drawer. The wallet was exactly where I had left it. My hands were shaking as I pulled it out. The expired license still tucked inside. I reached across the desk and handed it to him. He reached out for it, slowly. For a moment, he looked down at the wallet, and I almost thought he wasn't going to take it. Then he did, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. He straightened the lapel of his jacket, gave a small nod, and turned toward the hallway. I didn't follow him. I just sat there, listening to his footsteps fade across the empty mall. I stayed in that chair for a long time after that, mostly because I was afraid to stand up and see if he had cast a shadow. Jane and I went to the mall for the first time in years. I'd recently received a raise, so we decided to treat ourselves to something nice. Truthfully, neither of us liked malls. We preferred small shops, places run by actual people, the mom and pop stores. To me, the mall always represented something hollow about consumer culture. Still, we figured we might find a kiosk or a small shop tucked away somewhere inside. After parking, we stepped through the entrance and stopped at the directory. It was exactly what you'd expect, the usual national chains filling nearly every square of the map. Then we noticed something odd. The east wing of the mall trailed off. The little store squares continued on the map, but the store names stopped. Just blank spaces stretching down the hallway. We assumed the area was closed for renovation. The mall itself wasn't new. The building had been there since the 1980s, so construction seemed like the obvious explanation. Curious, we decided to head that way and see if anything was still open. At first, the mall looked normal. Teenagers drifted past in groups. Adults carried shopping bags. Everyone dressed in the same recognizable brands you see in every mall in America. They looked like walking advertisements. We passed the food court and entered the east wing. The crowd thinned almost immediately. There were fewer people here. The lighting was dimmer, flickering in places. An empty lobby opened up ahead of us with escalators and an elevator sitting idle. A carousel stood nearby, its paint chipped and horses frozen in place. The whole area felt off. Storefronts began giving way to darkness. Metal gates pulled halfway down, windows dark and signs faded. It wasn't closed for renovation. It was simply abandoned. Still, we kept walking. A man sat alone inside a small lost and found office. A woman worked a lonely cell phone kiosk with no customers. The Macy's at the end of the hall was shuttered. We assumed nothing else would be open this way. I half expected Jane to suggest turning around. Instead, she seemed fascinated by it. The emptiness and the strange quiet, like a place that had been forgotten. We rounded the bend, and the hallway was nearly empty now. The only other person was a mall cop, who watched us pass like we'd wandered somewhere we weren't supposed to. Every storefront was gated off, or plastered with space available signs and phone numbers to call. Then we saw something. It was at the very end of the corridor, beneath a dark overhang. A single light was on, like a beacon in the dark. It was a small shop, probably the smallest space in the entire mall, and it looked open. We wandered over to take a closer look. The shop had no signage at all, which felt strange for a mall. Every other storefront had a glowing logo or some kind of advertisement. This one had nothing. It looked entirely out of place. When we tried peering through the windows, we could barely make anything out. The glass was crowded with objects stacked so tightly together that it was hard to tell where one thing ended and another began. It looked like some sort of antique shop. We decided to try the door. It opened with the soft jingle of a bell. The smell hit us immediately. It reminded me of my grandmother's house. Mothballs, old wood, dust that had settled into furniture over the decades, the scent of age. But what surprised us more than anything was the sheer amount of stuff inside. The place was overflowing. Shelves bowed under the weight of porcelain figurines and glass paperweights. Rows of dolls stared blankly from cramped display cases, their painted eyes catching the dim light. Old radios with cracked dials sat beside stacks of yellowed books. Every surface held something. There were rotary telephones, a rack of pocket watches, their chains tangled together, wooden music boxes, tarnished metals. Furniture was piled on furniture. Even the ceiling had things hanging from it. Bird cages and old lanterns, wind chimes made of tarnished spoons. It felt less like a store and more like a place where objects had been collected and forgotten. Then, strangest of all, a young boy rose from behind the counter. I hadn't noticed him at first, the counter buried beneath stacks of clutter. He stood slowly, as if he had been crouched there the whole time watching us. He had no hair, not shaved or closely cropped. It looked as though he had simply never grown hair to begin with. He regarded us calmly. There was no surprise on his face, no hesitation, just the quiet expression of someone acknowledging another customer in a place where I imagined customers were rare. Jane and I smiled politely and continued browsing. After a moment, he spoke. "It's all for sale." Something about the way he said it felt strange. The words themselves were harmless enough, but his tone carried a certain finality, like he was clarifying a rule rather than making a sales pitch. Maybe he meant that nothing in the store was just for display. Still, it stuck with me. We continued looking through the shelves. The oddest part wasn't the antiques, old radios and tarnished silverware. Those made sense for a place like this. What didn't make sense were the things that felt personal, items that clearly belonged to someone else once, things people usually keep for themselves. A framed family photograph sat on a shelf, not a staged portrait, but the kind of snapshot someone takes in a backyard during summer. A father holding a toddler, a woman laughing mid-motion. The glass was cracked in one corner. Nearby sat a stack of handwritten birthday cards, rubber banded together, a leather wallet filled with faded receipts from a grocery store that no longer existed. There was a pair of prescription glasses folded neatly inside their case. Things that didn't look collected. They looked lost. The boy stepped out from behind the counter and began dusting a shelf. That nearly made me laugh. The place looked like the pinnacle of something unkept, and here he was carefully brushing dust off objects that had clearly been collecting it for decades. Then I noticed his feet. He wasn't wearing shoes. His clothes didn't look thrifted so much as discarded. His shirt was a size too small, stretched tight across his shoulders, and his shorts were frayed and torn along the bottom. That was the moment the place began to feel wrong. I suddenly had the urge to leave, not abruptly, just enough to say we had seen the place and move on. Jane seemed to feel the same way. Couples have a way of communicating that silently. I picked up a pair of cufflinks from the small tray and brought them to the counter. The boy smiled, though he didn't show his teeth. "How much?" I asked. That was another strange thing. None of the items in the shop had price tags. He tilted his head slightly and asked, "How much do you think it's worth?" The question caught me off guard. I assumed we were about to haggle, but I hadn't expected to set the price myself. "I don't know," I said. "How does $20 sound?" He looked at the cufflinks for a moment, then back at me. "It's on the house." The whole exchange left me more confused than anything else. One moment it felt like we were about to barter. The next he was trying to give them to me for free. "I don't feel comfortable taking them for nothing," I said, pulling a bill from my wallet. He gave a small nod. I'm not sure what that meant. I held the 20 out to him, but he didn't reach for it. He just watched. After an awkward moment, I set the bill on the counter. I took the cufflinks and Jane and I headed for the door. Just as we stepped outside, the boy called out from behind us, "It's all for sale." Something about the way he said it, again, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Jane and I agreed the whole thing had been one of the strangest experiences we'd ever had. On the walk back to the car, we laughed about it, half amused and half unsettled. Maybe the mall wasn't as boring as we thought. When we got home, I tossed the cufflinks into the junk drawer. I never expected to wear them. They were more of a curiosity than anything else. We went to bed early. The next morning, I woke up before Jane and decided to go for a jog. I was sitting on the edge of the bed pulling my socks on when I noticed something odd. Our family photo was gone. It had always sat on the dresser beside the snake plant. Same place for years, but the frame simply wasn't there. I gently shook Jane awake and asked if she had moved it. She groaned and waved an arm at me, still half asleep. I'd have to ask her later. I went downstairs to grab my keys. They were sitting on the table where I'd left them, but they were detached from my carabiner. The carabiner itself was missing. Now something felt wrong. I walked into the kitchen and started looking around. Slowly at first, then more carefully. Most things appeared normal. Plates where they should be, the coffee maker, the toaster, everything in place. For a moment I wondered if I was imagining things. But Jane and I keep a tight house. We're sort of neat freaks, proudly so. Things don't just wander off in our place. It didn't feel like misplacement. It felt like someone had gone through our belongings. I stood in the kitchen, trying to calm myself down. Then something about the table caught my eye. At first I couldn't place what looked different. Then it hit me. The white table runner, the one with the floral pattern. It was gone. The centerpiece sat directly on the bare wood. That's when I knew it wasn't all in my head. I went upstairs and woke Jane again, this time more urgently, and brought her downstairs to show her. She stared at the table, confused. She said she hadn't moved anything. It took a while before either of us said what we were both clearly thinking, that the cufflinks were cursed, or the store was cursed, that something about the whole experience had been wrong from the start. We're not people who jump to supernatural explanations. We're practical. Neither of us believes in ghosts or cursed objects, at least not ordinarily. But when something happens that refuses to fit inside any logical explanation, your mind starts reaching for the only answers left. No one had broken into our home, and if they had, why take things like that? A photo and a table runner, a carabiner. None of it made sense. Eventually, we got in the car and drove back to the mall. Now, this is the part where you might expect me to say the store was gone, that we reached the east wing and found nothing there but an empty corridor. Part of me wishes that had been the case. Then at least we'd have a clean ghost story. But the truth is, the shop was still there, exactly where we'd left it. The same light, glowing under the overhang. We stepped inside. The bell jingled again, but the boy wasn't there. We called out, but no one answered. Jane and I exchanged a look and started moving slowly through the aisles. The place somehow felt even more crowded than before. Objects were stacked higher, shelves sagging under the weight of things that seemed to have multiplied overnight. There was barely room to walk, and I couldn't shake the thought that if our missing items had somehow ended up here, we might just never find them. I had brought the cufflinks with me. I didn't want my money back. The $20 was still sitting on the counter where I'd left it the day before. I set the cufflinks beside it. Jane and I didn't wait around for the boy. We turned and walked out of the store. The drive home was quiet. Neither of us said much. I think we both hoped that whatever strange deal we'd made had somehow been undone. When we stepped inside the house, we looked around immediately, half expecting to see the runner back on the table, the family photo returned to the dresser, my carabiner clipped back onto my keys. Nothing new had vanished. but nothing lost had come back. I suppose there were no returns. I've been into urban exploration for several years now. Something about venturing into forbidden places that hold remnants of the past really excites me. It's honest fun. I like to think it's better than vandalizing these condemned places or leaving beer cans scattered everywhere. All I bring with me is my Nikon. I take photos and occasionally post them on my Tumblr page. It's about nostalgia for me. There's something haunting, strangely beautiful about the places I grew up with and what they've become. That's why the mall was my favorite place to explore. It's a strange hobby. You don't find a lot of like-minded people doing it. My girlfriend Julie would come along on my outings. She liked the adventure, the thrill of doing something you're not supposed to. But she wouldn't come with me into the pit. We'd been back to the mall a handful of times by then. Each visit revealed something new. In a place that vast, there's always something left behind. When we explored the east side of the building for the first time, I stumbled upon something strange. The floor had caved in. It was right at the base of the escalator, a dark hole in the tile. A steady dripping sound echoed from inside. I took a photo. The flash from the Nikon lit the edges of the break in the floor. Julie stood beside me, unsettled. The collapse looked wrong, not jagged or chaotic like you'd expect. At first, I thought it was a trick of light, but it looked like the escalator stairs continued downward, into the hole, into the darkness. I pulled my phone's flashlight and stepped closer. Julie was anxious. It was dangerous, stupid, honestly. I told her I just wanted a better look. That's when I saw it. The gleam of ribbed metal steps. It was the escalator, descending below the mall. A subterranean escalator. I took a few more photos, and we left. The next evening, I was working late, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. What was at the bottom of the pit? It defied logic. A floor partitioned between two sets of stairs, one leading down into something that shouldn't have existed. It felt like something out of a dream. I decided that night I would go back. I knew Julie wouldn't like it, so I didn't tell her. My camera bag was already in the car, so I drove straight to the mall after work. It was raining hard when I got there, my old windshield wipers groaning as they dragged across the glass. The abandoned structure came into view, massive and obsolete, a relic of a time long past. When I went inside, it was empty. It usually was, aside from winos and graffiti artists, or the rare sighting of another urban explorer. But this felt entirely empty. You could tell from the silence alone, broken only by the patter of rainwater. It slipped through a shattered skylight and tapped steadily against the linoleum floor. I approached the area where the hole was, where the underground stairway waited. It was exactly where I'd seen it the day before. I set my pack down and prodded the edge with my boot, testing the surrounding tile to see if it might give way. The rupture seemed isolated to that single section where the escalator descended. I stood there for a long while, staring into it, but I knew I had to go down. I had to see what was below. This would be my greatest discovery to date. Even if it was nothing more than a vast empty room, it was beneath the mall, something hidden and only exposed by years of neglect. I crab-walked over the lip of the escalator and began descending slowly into the abyssal dark. My phone's flashlight wasn't very powerful, so I couldn't see the bottom for some time. The steps carried on much farther than the escalator above ever had. The space around me felt enormous. I didn't see any support beams. Architecturally, it made no sense. It was as if the mall above was floating over a cavern. Then I started to feel something. The faintest sense of motion. It started subtle, then grew into something gradual and familiar, like the slow hum of machinery coming alive, as if the escalator were bringing me down. I stopped. Visually, nothing had changed. The steps beneath my feet were still. The darkness still pressed in around me. But I felt it. The sensation of descent. There was a bottom, maybe 70 or 80 feet below the break in the floor. When my light finally reached it, I saw checkered tile, colorful, dated, unmistakably from the 1990s. For a moment, I half expected to see storefronts and faceless shoppers drifting by. Instead, there were metallic doors lining a hallway. The layout mirrored the mall above, but stripped of style and color. It was industrial, characterless, a hollow version of what sat overhead. I approached the first door and pulled it open slowly, metal groaning in protest. The smell hit me immediately. It was rot and mildew, something sweet and sour all at once. I stepped back, pulling my shirt over my nose before angling the flashlight inside. The room was enormous, larger than I'd expected. Mountains of clothing were piled high. T-shirts, jeans, dresses, and shoes. The heaps rose so tall that my beam couldn't find their ceiling. Everything was damp and mold-ridden. Many pieces had decayed beyond recognition. Some tags were still visible. Abercrombie and American Eagle, brands so closely tied to the mall above. Was this an abandoned stockroom? Some overflow storage forgotten over time? It looked more like a landfill. When I stepped back into the hallway, something stopped me cold. A mannequin stood in the center. I hadn't noticed it before. Its face was grotesque, partially melted. Features warped as though exposed to heat. It wore rotting clothes, once stylish, now hanging in tatters much like the piles in the room I'd just left. I raised my flashlight. Further down the hall, silhouettes stood in the darkness. More mannequins. Different poses, different styles. Some leaned slightly. Some faced blank walls where display windows would have been in the mirrored mall above. They stood scattered throughout the corridor like an abandoned art installation. I lifted my camera and snapped photos. The flash burst white in the dark. The mannequins didn't move. They didn't react. I walked past them, weaving around them as though navigating an occupied mall. My heart was hammering now. It wasn't just surreal. It was wrong. The mildew-heavy air clung to my lungs, and for the first time, I wondered what I was actually breathing down here. I could only imagine what lay behind the other doors. More rooms of discarded, forgotten things. The hallway stretched on endlessly. Mannequins posed like people waiting for something that would never come. I decided to turn back. I would return. I already knew that. This was a treasure, something I wanted to share. Maybe I could even convince Julie to come next time. As I retraced my steps, I noticed something strange. The mannequins hadn't changed position, not directly, at least not in any way I could point to. But in the corners of my vision, subtleties began to tickle my brain in the worst way. An arm slightly higher than before, a head angled just a little more toward me. I knew it was my mind playing tricks. It had to be. But by all accounts, this place shouldn't even physically exist. My sense of reality began to feel thin. I picked up the pace, moving faster toward the escalator. Had I really come this far? The walk back felt much longer. The thought alone made me quicken my stride. The subtleties grew more frequent. There were more mannequins now, or at least it felt that way. The hallway no longer looked sparse and abandoned. It felt crowded, like prime time for shopping. My pulse thudded in my ears. Panic crept in. Where was the escalator? Sounds began filtering in, faint at first. Whispers, the soft shuffle of footsteps. Was that music? Distant and tinny, like mall speakers bleeding through static. I turned abruptly, scanning the corridor behind me, half expecting a mannequin to be sprinting toward me. They stood where they'd been. Still, I stepped backward and bumped into something. A dull tunk echoed off the walls. I'd knocked over one of them. Its head and arm had separated from the body, rolling a short distance across the tile. The sight of it filled me with a strange, immediate guilt, like I'd committed some unspeakable act. I turned again. The mannequins. They were all looking at me. I felt a prickling heat rise in my cheeks. Then I ran. I think I even shut my eyes at one point, like a child afraid of what might be standing in front of him. When I opened them, the escalator was there, right in front of me. I nearly ran right into it. When I turned back, at the edge of the darkness, I could see faint silhouettes. They were all facing my direction. I ran up the escalator 2 steps at a time, stumbling more than once as my legs turned to rubber. I climbed and climbed until my hands reached the lip of the hole, and I pulled myself back into the mall above. I was still here. It was all still here. And I think that is what scared me the most.